I'm Jerome Weeks. They're less than 2 feet tall, but the statues, known as the Mourners, may be the greatest little-known works of French medieval art. Why? The Mourners is an exhibition of 40 sculptures from a duke's tomb in Dijon, France. Heather MacDonald is an associate curator at the Dallas Museum of Art. She helped arrange the unprecedented show, which will tour 7 museums in the United States. Heather, welcome to Think.
Thank you.
Now, since the 15th century, these statues were around the tomb of the Duke, John the Fearless, one of the most powerful dukes in Burgundy in northern France. So set the scene for us. How did they fit in this setting?
Well, that's one thing that I think visitors to the exhibition will hope to give them many opportunities to envision these sculptures as part of a much larger, very complex, very beautiful tomb that had elaborate architectural framework around the outside of the monument, and each of these figures fit into these wonderful little niches. And so as the figures, as you moved around the tomb, you would see these figures seemingly moving within this beautiful late Gothic architecture that encircled the tomb. Well, on top, there were effigies, recumbent figures of the Duke and his wife, the Duchess, and these were painted in full realistic color, whereas below there was a very minimal use of color, and really the white alabaster of the sculptures against a black marble background really sort of played a very a rich role with these luxurious materials and this striking contrast. So it was a very complex tomb, very complex series of meanings, of which visitors will see one part, and one part that's quite difficult to see when you see the tombs in person.
Lately they've been in a museum in Dijon, but originally they were in a chapel in the Charter House?
Right. These tombs were commissioned. In fact, an entire elaborate monastic complex was commissioned to house the tombs, and they were at the center of this chapel at the Charter House of Champmont. And a charter house is simply a monastery for Carthusian monks. It's the name for this particular type of monastery. And the first Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, built this huge, important monastery really as a place to hold the tomb of himself and his descendants, his lineage. So it was really creating a mausoleum for his dynasty, and that was the original setting where these tombs would have been seen.
Now, in such a setting, it's easy to see the Mourners as part of this incredibly elaborate construction of architecture, sculpture, painting.
Yes.
So why then are the Mourners extracted from that still considered such masterworks worthy of this exhibition by themselves?
Well, I think that's actually one of the astonishing things as we started working on the exhibition is, you see these sculptures removed from the tomb and photographed. They're incredibly sort of satisfying aesthetic experiences, independent of what their intended destination. And although they were always meant to sort of be tucked into these architectural niches, when brought out of it, they are very richly conceived in 3 dimensions, and that's, I think, shows certainly the ambition of these tombs, but also the dynamism of the artistic conception that in older versions of tombs of this type, there might have been relief sculpture on the outside that showed, again, in just very low relief, these kinds of mourners circulating around architecture. But this was something completely new, where these figures had a kind of presence, a independent reality, separate from the tomb itself.
They're remarkably detailed and individual expressions of grief, and yet they're also this collective, this mass expression of grief that's really quite powerful when you see it in total.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of what makes this exhibition so moving is being able to see portrait-like representations. The exhibition begins with the start of what would have been a sort of grand funeral procession, the representation of a funeral procession for the Duke with clergy, a bishop, cantors, and so on, followed by monks, and then a large number of mourners that they're not differentiated because they're cloaked in what would have been at the time identical black cloaks. And this was part of standard funeral practice for rulers, is to distribute hundreds of these identical black cloaks in which mourners would dress themselves, so that the Duke's family, the highest members of the court, would have been dressed in the same way as members of the poorest people in the city that were invited to participate in these processions, so that the full society of Burgundy coming out to mourn their duke would have been united in that moment of grief and mourning.
Why can they tour now?
Well, the museum in Dijon, the Museum of Fine Arts in the city of Dijon, where they've been housed since the early 19th century, is undergoing renovations. It's actually one of the oldest museums in France, founded around the same time as the Louvre, but in this great provincial capital. And the museum is in 18th, really in 15th century, 18th century, and 19th century buildings. And so it's a very old museum and will be undergoing extensive renovations. And they're beginning with the oldest part of the museum, these 15th century buildings built by the Dukes of Burgundy, and that is where the tombs are currently have been displayed since the early 19th century. And so while these rooms are closed for renovation, the director of the museum, Sophie Jougy, wanted to send these figures out so that they would be, in a way, cultural ambassadors of the city, of the region, of the museum itself, and that they would have a new audience, because they're icons in Dijon, in France, and in Europe, but perhaps less well known to American audiences.
Why aren't they better known? I mean, this is their first real tour, but there are a lot of major altarpieces and masterpiece murals that can't tour either.
Sure. Well, I think part of it is there's still, in the canon of art history, probably a privilege towards the sort of history of Italian art, that way that the transition from the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance. And I think that story, as it's told in Florence, is perhaps better known than in the north. And particularly a court like Dijon, that was there's a wonderful sort of hybrid nature to the art that was produced there, where it drew from the court style of Paris, it drew from the north, the great Flemish artists of the north, and so it was a very unique artistic capital, but perhaps a little bit outside of what we would think of being the main streams of art history that get narrated in undergraduate art history courses.
Quickly now, the first stop for the Mourners in the United States was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in the Medieval Hall.
Yes.
But they presented them as an entire procession, and the DMA is presenting them differently. Why?
Well, each museum will have really quite a different presentation, and we really wanted to show some of the figures individually so that you could circulate all the way around them and appreciate them as one individual work of art. There still will be a sequence. You'll still be able to appreciate the sort of sequence of these figures as a procession, but there will be more differentiation, each one seen in its own sort of character and uniqueness as well. And
there's an attempt to kind of give the impression of the original setting, the original tomb.
Right, and the exhibition design does evoke architectural details from Champmont, this monastery where the tombs were intended to be seen, and in a sort of abstract way we've been able to suggest that setting.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.